Well, we were singing at least in that second song, and I know every once in a while every time I lead singing, I seem to notice, of course, maybe it's because I'm getting older, you start noticing how many songs are about death. Really. It's really not about death, but it includes death because we're looking beyond death, looking to that day when we're going to lie silent in the grave and be raised up. But it's like, man, there's a lot of songs on that. So when you're younger, I don't think you think about that as much. So, well, tonight we are in, again, number 5. We're in chapter 3, number 5 in our series on the book of Judges. Our numbers with the lessons do not coordinate with the chapter. That's not going to hold true because we're only going to get through about 5 verses tonight from chapter 3, verse 7 through verse 11. We're going to focus a little bit, at least we see in verse 9, that's our theme for tonight. When the children of Israel cried unto the Lord raised up a deliverer to the children of Israel, who delivered them, even Othniel, the son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother. We're going to begin our second section or division of the book now. We're done with the intro. So if you remember, we're starting with that second part, or number 2 of the outline. I enlarged the words a little bit, but the Lord raised up judges. It's going to take us from chapter 3, verse 7, all the way to the end of chapter 16. Now, before we get going too, I'm going to add some information that I think that I have neglected to add into this series. And it's more as an oversight. When you get to reading, you'll read so much and you get so much material, and then you forget. It's like, oh yeah, I need to put that verse in there. So that's why I'm going to add a couple of them in there tonight. The first one has to do with the length of this period. And I think I said 300 to 400 years in there before, but I'm going to give you a little bit more. The second point I'm going to bring up is a reminder of what I said about Eli before Samuel, that he was a judge, so a bad one. But the first part is to bring up something about that chronology, and has to do with the Apostle Paul when he was preaching. You might remember when he was rehearsing the whole story of Israel in the book of Acts. And he's doing this before the rulers in the synagogue. Now you have to think that he's not going to fabricate or be outside of probably what they also understood to be the times of the judges. And it says in Acts chapter 13 and verse 20, after that he gave unto them judges, talking about God gave them judges, about the space of 450 years until Samuel the prophet. So you get that history right there and the 450 years. Now it's interesting because the reason why I think I was a little ambiguous before is so many people give so many differences on it. And when you count it up in what you find in the list that's there, you only come up to about 390 years. But you have to add in Eli, and then you have to add in Samuel as well, and you end up with approximately 450 years. But calculations can run some as low as 175 years, but most of them from 300 up to 470 years. Also, I had mentioned that Eli should be counted as a judge, but I was a little ambiguous. But if you look in 1 Samuel 14 and 18, it records Eli's death. And when it does that, it says he had judged Israel 40 years. So there's no question that he was a judge. Problem comes into a lot of people's minds. Well, normally you see God raised up a judge. We don't hear anything about Eli. We only hear him as acting as a judge and giving the decisions of other things in their social, and you can see it with his sons. And he was corrupt. As we study this section, and probably every section having to do with the judge, we're going to kind of focus on some different things. Again, But when we see it again, I forgot that it's in 1 Samuel 4:18 about Eli, and at the end of it, you notice in the highlight, after he fell backward on the side of the gate, break his neck, he died, for he was an old man and heavy, and he had judged Israel 40 years. I didn't have my little note that I had that in red, that it was going to come up as a slide. Now we'll get to the basic outline. We're going to look at basically kind of 5 points for each one of them. Not all of them are going to have information. Some of them are going to be blank. There's not going to be anything there. Most of it, we can find out something, at least the name of the judge. We'll learn something about the children of Israel. A repetitious, well, we'll see it in this lesson tonight, but a repetitious comment about the children of Israel is that they did evil in the sight of the Lord. And we're going to then look at the oppressor, whether it's the Mesopotamians, as it is tonight, or the Midianites, the Amorites, or who it might be. We'll list those and look at those. Then we'll spend a real brief amount of time on the chronology itself, how many years were involved. And then lastly, we'll try to do a simple application that we can take from that lesson and make it generally to us in our lives. Now, when I say that, as I go through this, all of it, you're going to see that I'm going to be making application as we go through it. So you'll see that it's going to be included kind of in a lot of the verses and stuff that we read. So let's go ahead and read the whole section. It's not a lot, so we don't have to spend a lot of time on it, but it's important, I think, that we read it. And then if you're studying along with me on your own, just focus on those verses. Focus on what you notice that's in those verses. Let's start with it. Verse 7, and the children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord, and forgot the Lord their God, and served Balaam and the groves. Therefore the anger of the Lord was hot against Israel, and he sold them into the hand of Shushan-Rishathaim, king of Mesopotamia. I tried this so many times, and I did pretty good this afternoon again, but that's a terrible name. It really is. And the children of Israel served Shushan-Rishathaim 8 years. We will call him the king of Mesopotamia. I can say that much easier. Verse 9, and when the children of Israel cried unto the Lord raised up a deliverer to the children of Israel, who delivered them, even Othniel, the son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother. And the Spirit of the Lord came upon him, and he judged Israel, and went out to war. And the Lord delivered Shushan-Rishathaim, king of Mesopotamia, into his hand, and his hand prevailed against Shushan-Rishathaim. Not bad on that one. And the land had rest 40 years. And Othniel, the son of Kenaz, died. Like I said, we're going to look first at the judge, and the judge will kind of be our main focus, but not our only. And I mention this again, that we are sometimes not supplied with very much information on all of the judges, or on the battle, or their actions during their time as a judge. Some information we will look at tonight will be repeated in the cycle that's repeated throughout in these chapters. So we're not going to get past Othniel. That's all we're going to get to in his section on him tonight, because we're going to be spending a little bit more time on some background and some things. What's also interesting is basically, once you read through this, the names and the places will change, but the sin will remain the same. In this first judge that God raised up, again, we'll speak more details in this lesson, but as we progress, we will not repeat them, but try to just simply refer back as we progress through the narrative about the judges of Israel. So let's look at Judah first, at Othniel first. And Othniel was of the tribe of Judah. It's interesting that tribe of Judah was the prominent tribe in chapter 1. Remember that the children of Israel said, now that Joshua's died, who will go up for us? Who will fight? Judah will go up. Well, he would seem to be the one that was chosen by God to deliver an answer to their question now that Joshua's dead. We're going to give a little bit on Othniel. His name means the Lion of God, and he was probably about 75 years old. Most calculations, it seems to me, that sits right when God raised him up. He served for 40 years, as we read, so that would mean that if he started at 75, he died at 115. It's not outlandish because of the fact, too, that we know Joshua lived till 110 at this particular time. Interesting that Othniel's lineage is somewhat problematic because of some people reading into a great deal about it. That was he Caleb's brother or was he his nephew? Is he related by marriage and blood? Many say he was a younger half-brother. Some same mother, different father. Others say he was just his Caleb's nephew, and that's what I'm going to put in there. I think he was Caleb's nephew. That's what it is. There's an age difference between them, which is interesting when you think between Caleb and Othniel, that it's likely that he was somewhere between 17 to 20 years old, or 17 to 20 years younger than was, and possibly, 17 to 21 years younger, could have been even more, younger than Caleb. That's considering the fact that Caleb, as a spy, was 40 at the time they went in to spy out the land. That would mean that Othniel could not be any older than 19 because those 20 and older were going to die. So he had to be younger than that. So that is also interesting because we'll get into it a little bit later, but it makes him witness to an awful lot of things. But you have to remember that it also talks about that generation that had witnessed those miraculous events had passed away. So that's where it could be that he was a lot younger than that. When he is first mentioned, it's when Caleb asked for a volunteer to take the city of Debir. And his daughter, if you remember, was the prize. And Othniel won the hand of Caleb's daughter when he defeated Debir, which was also a land that was most likely filled with giants. His victory over Chushan-Rishathaim was probably at least 39 years after his initial fight with Debir and victory there. But no details are listed. In fact, when you look at what it says, he went out to war. That's it. We don't learn anything more. I mean, think about how much you learn about Gideon and the Midianites. But here, it just says he went out to war and he won. That's it. That's all we get. No details except for their identity. Assumptions have to be made, though, because he had to be able to raise troops up to fight against them. He led them into battle. I'm going to talk a little bit about the oppressors, that they seem to be more of a marauding, skilled, pillaging force that did that to survive and expand their kingdom. Israel was under oppression by them for about 8 years, and he served for 40 different years. So 40, I shouldn't say different years, just 40 years that he served as a judge. And during that time, Israel lived in peace all the days of Othniel while he was judge. So when I look at him, as little is said, you have to be able to read a little bit into it. But I'm going to give you some things about Othniel that I can see. To me, number one, he was courageous. He was capable. Number three, he was certified. By that, I mean God called him. Okay. He was complete. I'll speak to each of these a little bit. He was complicated, and he was conscientious. That seems like a lot for not writing too much, but when I say he was courageous, he was a man who followed Caleb's example, and he did not fear the Anakims in Debir. He was familiar with the enemy and was not deterred by their size or their strength. Now, I get that because I'm going to give you a little bit about the oppressor before I actually get in there. They were a very talented army. They were a very organized army. It is said that they had chariots and horsemen. They were hired out to others to fight. So it was something to be able to go against this well-armed, well-organized military force when you don't have any of that here. When I say he was capable, he was able to fight and win against a superior force in both size and strength. He is a man that is skilled as both a fighter and as a leader. He was, again, part of earlier battles. In fact, even as a young boy, he could have been possibly there at the Battle of Jericho, at Og, Sihon, at the crossing of Jordan. But he learned a great deal from Caleb and from Joshua. When I say that he was certified, I mean that he was called by God and he was empowered by the Spirit. Remember, the scripture says that God raised up judges. So God raised him up. God qualified him for the job. In verse 10, it tells us that God certified this man as a judge, as the deliverer, as, if you will, the Savior. The enemy were much more sophisticated and better armed physically, but Othniel was better armed spiritually. What an encouragement for us when we think about enemies against us, that we can see that we're outmanned, we're outgunned, there's no way. Well, yes we can, because we've got a greater God. I say he was complete because, again, the land had rest for 40 years. The entire time that he was judge, he had led in that battle, then he led in decisions, and he gave Israel complete peace during his entire time of service. Again, the Lord came upon him. The Spirit of the Lord filled him and gave him that ability to be able to function. When I say complicated, I go back to that story of Debir. It's interesting that his wife asked him to go to her father and ask for a piece of land and to ask for the waters that were there. But he didn't do that. If you notice, she did it. I don't know anything of why, but he didn't do it. He was spiritually charged. We just know this, again, general information that's here. I don't know how he raised the army. I don't know what all he did, but it seems a little more complicated than just what you have, that he judged Israel and he went out to war. That's all you know. These verses are all we even have to tell us his time as a judge. And then lastly, I say conscientious. I could say consistent. He was devoted to his family and to his God. He heeded the call and he stayed constant and on course for the full term until he died. He served until he died. You ready to do that? You don't get to retire from serving the Lord. You may retire from a task that you might be doing in serving the Lord, but then you just step over and take another job. You know, that's the way we ought to be. He influenced others to follow after the Lord. You have to think about it. He was consistent while others were falling away, while others were falling prey to the worship of false gods and the influence of the people who were worshiping Baal and all of the groves, he didn't fall prey to that. Othniel stayed faithful and was ready to lead when God called him and then empowered him. Now, let's look at the children of Israel. From the text, we can read it very clearly. Number one, they did evil in the sight of the Lord. That's just a general overview of their activities and their attitude. We're not told much else than that. We've already been told, though, that most of the tribes, and in particular even Judah, allowed the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, and the Hivites to dwell among them. They made covenants with them, which they were forbidden to do. They also allowed their children to intermarry. This was even later on when they finally had kings. This was also Solomon's failure. You think about the wisest man in the world, the wisest man that ever existed. Well, he allowed his wives to turn his heart away from the Lord. You can read that in 1 Kings chapter 11. In Israel's history, it became so bad that many of the Jews during the time of Nehemiah, that they were so infiltrated by these other communities and cultures that Nehemiah says in chapter 13 that they forgot their own language and they adopted the speech of Ashdod. So when it says they did evil, read a little bit more and you kind of find out a little bit more about what that evil means. Then it says not only did they do evil, but they forgot the Lord. Now, how do you do that? Well, what that means, though, is they abandoned worship and the practices that they were taught. They did not practice separation from the nations. They left their own faith and they failed to follow after the Lord. The whole thing is the practice of their faith was forgotten. Do you know how many times I can be introduced to a preacher or talk to a preacher and we begin to talk about our families and we'll ask for prayers with one another and find out that that pastor or preacher is asking for prayer for a grandchild that is not serving the Lord or that is not even saved. Imagine that. How would that break your heart to know you have a grandchild or even a child that's not serving the Lord? They are forgetting all the things that they've been taught that you raised them up to do. The practice of their faith was actually forgotten. And it doesn't take but a generation for that to happen. The Lord and his mighty works were not remembered. Maybe that's because they were not rehearsed to every generation after all the mighty works that God did to liberate them from Egypt. You would think, you would want, that's why I think you go back to the patriarchs before Genesis chapter 6, when you have from Adam all the way up to Noah, and you see those great men of God and how long they lived. They had a testimony. I mean, imagine, Adam was 830 years old before he died? And the fact is that he was able to tell people right then and there, I walked with God. I was in the garden with God. The reason why you're a sinner and you're inclined to do these things is because I broke God's law. I ate of the fruit of the tree. I mean, he could tell them exactly what happened. Well, they forgot. Why? It doesn't tell us, but they did indeed forget. Then it says they served Balaam. In fact, it says they served Balaam and the groves. And this is not the last time that Balaam is mentioned in this book as a source of trouble to Israel. Balaam was worshipped by offering sacrifices to a false god. They burned incense. They honored them with special attire, special jewelry, and then they involved themselves with their hedonistic practices. Hosea writes this, In Hosea chapter 2 and verse 13, he says, and I will visit upon her the days of Balaam, talking about Israel, wherein she burned incense to them, and she decked herself with earrings and her jewels, and she went after her lovers and forgot me, saith the Lord. They got involved. Dress up with the different avenues of worship, probably the days that were set aside, all of the things, they began to involve themselves with their culture and forgot about their own culture. Like I said, even so far as they forgot how to even speak Hebrew. Amazing. The groves that are mentioned were special places designated to honor and worship these false gods. They were where they put their idols, where they planted trees and gardens to honor their gods, in particular Ashtaroth. That's usually, again, in the groves where there are other false deities that they worshiped. The groves were not just trees, but they were areas where, again, they would have their idols and made of wood, and God commanded that they be thrown down, destroyed, and burned. That's what needed to happen to them. In fact, at one point, King Josiah of Israel commanded that the temple be cleansed. What was in the temple? Lo and behold, there were some of these false idols in there. He ordered Hilkiah the high priest to remove and burn even the vessels that had been made for Baal and the groves, and then get rid of the ashes, take them out. They sent them to Bethel. So there was a lot of involvement with the service of Balaam. Jeremiah was asked by God if he'd seen Israel during the time of Josiah's reign, and he said, have you seen the backsliding that they had done? It's in Jeremiah 3 and 6. They ended up planting their own groves, and it says, upon every high mountain and under every green tree. Now, because of Israel's spiritual adultery, it says that God's anger was hot against them. And that's why he sold them into the hand of the Mesopotamian marauders. And this really, when it talks about it hot, this is speaking of God's fury. It's talking about his indignation. Remember, God is a jealous God. And as far as a Christian, you got to make sure, even Paul talks about it, you ought not to mix your worship up with the heathens. Keep it separate. You don't go to their churches. You don't get involved in participating in these false worship of false gods. In fact, Nahum speaks of the same when he wrote in Nahum 1 and 6, who can stand before his indignation? Who can abide in the fierceness of his anger? His fury is poured out like fire, and the rocks are thrown down by him. This was the nature, really, of God using the king of Mesopotamia to chasten Israel for their backsliding. Because they served Balaam, God was so angry with them, he used a foreign, wicked nation. This is what baffled Habakkuk. How can you use them to chasten your people, God? Well, you just sit there and watch, and you'll learn. They also, lastly, served as a tributary. That means that they were given, and by the way, we'll look at it a little bit later too, that when we talk about the Mesopotamians, it's kind of too, people will say, well, this is an old Syria, or they call it Aram, I believe it is. But they were, in other words, because they were a tributary, they're giving them money, goods, or services, and probably all three. Plus, they had to obey their rules. They literally submitted to their authority and control, and it was so wicked and so hard on them that they were crying unto the Lord. And that lasted 8 years. Of course, after they were freed, they had 40 years of peace. I'm going to have to jump down because I look up and see what time it is. Let's look at the oppressor real quick, and we'll go through again. I love pronouncing this guy's name. Chushan-Rishathaim, king of Mesopotamia. Most say that his seat of power was probably near the Euphrates River and the Tigris. It would be modern-day Turkey, often called Syria today. Some also consider them to be the Midianites. That one I hadn't really heard about too much at all. But they were the ones, again, that had armor, they had chariots, very skilled warriors. They were a very powerful force, but apparently they were a short-lived power, and God saw to it that they were wiped out. They were quickly raised up power. They conquered a lot of territory, but they lost power as well. Nothing else is really known about them politically, but the fact that they were the oppressors of the children of Israel, and they are first on the list, and we know that they worshiped Balaam. Their name that we see of Chushan-Rishathaim is also having to do with, when you define that, has to do with double wickedness. So he's real bad. Again, 1 Chronicles 19:6 talks about that they were hired out by the children of Ammon, who hired their chariots and their horsemen. We already mentioned before, too, they were very hedonistic people in their religious practices, but they faded after what appears to be an Assyrian rise into power, who reduced their reign over Mesopotamia. The children of Israel seem to join them in, first of all, crying unto Balaam, not in anguish, but in worship, until they were so sore oppressed, then they began to cry unto Jehovah. The chronology of this is real simple, and I'll be real quick on this one. You begin to see the cycle of backsliding. They were oppressed for 8 years, and it's kind of easy to see the chronology. You see it written right in the text there. God delivers them by the judge Othniel, and then they have 40 years of peace. So you can kind of see 8 and 40. So we're talking about just under 50 years. Sadly, as soon as Othniel dies, the children of Israel did evil again in the sight of the Lord. And that's where then you'll see that God strengthens Eglon, king of Moab, against Israel, and the cycle continues over. Now let me close up with the application and be real quick. What kind of application can we make between Othniel and ourselves? I think, first off, that Othniel had a humble confidence. Secondly, I think that he had a courageous dependence. And thirdly, he had an honorable character. When I say that he had a humble confidence, he wasn't arrogant. He wasn't a braggadocious man. He knew that his victories were by God's power. And he is stepping up because God called him to do. So he knows it's by God's power. That makes him humble. I'm saying he is dependent, and we'll get into that a little bit after this too. But I think too that he found his courage from his family. The courage to trust God. Remember, he had a father-in-law and an uncle-in-law by the name of Joshua and Caleb. And these were two men who were at their peak of examples for others to follow. What an example. They were his inspiration. A man who ordered the sun to stand still. A man who blew the horn probably, or had the horn, gave the order for when the walls of Jericho tumbled down. They saw the Jordan stop flowing and gave them dry ground to walk across. You know, even the fact that he could point back to the Jordan River and say, see the memorial rock piles that are there? Remember the story? This is where and why. Caleb was also an 80-year-old man. Remember I said that Othniel was probably about 75. He's an old man. I mean, that's, we can identify with that. And yet, Caleb was 80 years old when he said, give me this mountain. That's what his encouragement was. So we can apply his confidence. He was confident, but he was not arrogant or self-righteous. And he was courageous in his dependence. In other words, he could see what the enemy, and they were better off than him, but he depended upon God. Was there any trouble? Othniel took care of it. He made the final judgment. He passed sentence. He exonerated or liberated. He was the one who was active and consistent for 40 years in that place of leadership. I think, too, we can add easily in that honorable character that he didn't do this alone. He had to raise an army, and he had done it before, but he knew that God had enabled him, and he trusted in God's call, and other people believed in him, so they followed him, because he couldn't do it alone. That's why I say courageous dependence as well. Then if you look at the children of Israel, what can we learn about them? Well, we learn that there's easy to see a bad cycle that's capable of existing in all of us. If that happens, we need to learn how to break the cycle. It's likely that we could be stuck in that cycle, that you could be stuck in that cycle. The enemies in these stories will change. The enemies in these stories, their names will change, their locations will change, their events will be different, but the story is still the same. The cycle must be broken, but for it to be broken, you have to see the cycle. You have to identify the cycle in you. Now, you don't have the king of Mesopotamia. You don't have the Midianites. You don't have all these, but we still have this cycle of sin and this repetition that can happen with us. But we can also learn that if we cry unto the Lord, if we repent unto the Lord, then we can change where we're at. The whole point is that we need to be reminded that deliverance is possible no matter what trouble we get into. Don't let down your guard. The sacrifice or price to pay for enjoying sin for a season is not worth the price. It's just not. Be an Othniel. Be strong, be courageous, and faithful to the end. Israel slid slowly away the moment that we read, and Othniel the son of Kenaz died. What do I learn from that? Keep your deliverer in sight. Keep his path right ahead of you. And make sure that your communication with your master is always open. Those are three key applications that you should be able to learn from the children of Israel and their failure to do just what we're encouraged to do. I pray that's been a blessing tonight. I know we went a little bit long, and so you can see that this might not be as quick a study as you thought with some of the information that's here, but I think it will bless you to study along with me.